I'm Ashutosh Varshney, Director of the Saxena Center, and I welcome you all to this fourth meeting of the joint Brown-Harvard-MIT seminar on South Asia. Two meetings have taken place at Harvard under Gautam's direction there, or convenership there, and this is the second meeting at Brown, and the next meeting of the joint seminar will be at Harvard, and the speaker on April 5th is Avidit Acharya from Stanford, who will be speaking on mass education in Nepal. And Prerna Singh will be the discussant there on his paper. Today's meeting, at long last, is on economics, but let's say political economy. What I read this morning suggested a serious political economy thrust. And our two speakers are making a presentation based on their book manuscript, which is ready and is being reviewed, 1/6 of Humanity, the Development Odyssey of India's Precocious Democracy. Arvind Subramanian will start. He is currently a Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He was here a fellow at the Watson Institute and at Saxena Center until this past July. And he came to us from Ashoka University, where he was a professor, and before that at the Harvard Kennedy School. But for a very long time, he worked at the International Monetary Fund, and before that, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. I will be very brief about all introductions. The two books worthy of note, here several. One is Eclipse, Living in the Shadow of China's Economic Dominance, and then India's Turn, Understanding the Economic Transformation. Our second author is Devesh Kapur. Devesh is currently at the School of Advanced International Studies, Hopkins, and he previously taught at University of Pennsylvania and before that Harvard, with a brief stint at UT Austin. And his books include two that are published in my Modern South Asia series at Oxford University Press, New York, including our biggest seller, which was called The Other 1%. That was the title, along with two other authors. And I think that was the first book in our series, and it has been our largest seller thus far for the last 10 years. So the plan, and I'll introduce the discussants later. The plan is that Arvind and Devesh will take up to 20 to 25 minutes presenting two chapters of the book, and they will also introduce us the whole book, actually. And then the two discussants for the two chapters will take up to 15 minutes, and I'll introduce them when their turn comes. So let's start. I think Arvind goes first.
Okay, Ashu, thanks very much for hosting us. Very kind of you. Also delighted that Yashi and Simon are going to give us comments on this draft manuscript. Before I launch into one of the chapters that I'm going to present, just a very brief introduction about the book. It's a book that Devesh and I have been working on for 3 years, thinking about it for upwards of 10, 15 years. The provisional title, we're open to suggestions, is as you see here. The book is kind of in 4 parts, and one of the aims of the book is that it's going to be a broader understanding of Indian economic development and not a pure economist perspective or a political science perspective. because we do think that economic development happens as a rich interaction between states, society, nation, and markets in the context, in the case of India, of democratic politics, and how all of these come together over 75 years is the somewhat, immodest and ambitious aim of the book. Origin, how it began, how India built the Hobbesian state. Then a second part on state, markets, and economy, which is going to be about growth, the fiscal state, and then India and the world. The third part on state, society, and development, how these three come together. There's going to be a chapter on public sector enterprises, which Devesh is going to present, a chapter on public goods, a chapter on how good the state has been at doing things. And then the last part is, India is, as you know, such a vast and varied and heterogeneous country. So briefly touch upon, the variety of development experiences across the Indian states, which are absolutely fascinating, as well as how did India build a nation by having to straddle and contend with all these myriad cleavages that so many people have spoken about. So that's kind of the broad structure of the book. And I'm going to present, one chapter out of three. There are going to be three growth chapters. One is going to be today the 4 eras of performance and policy, why each of them is misunderstood. Then chapter 2, some of which is already in the draft, but which we want to pull out, is the planning era, why we saw weak growth, scarcity, and no structural transformation. And then the neoliberal era, which I think the deep mystery is, why did we, unlike the East Asian economies, get the rapid economic growth, but didn't get the structural transformation, including employment creation? So when people say, oh, India didn't create jobs, etc., weak employment, weak structural transformation, I think that's a less interesting question than understanding why it didn't get that despite rapid economic growth, which is almost a precondition to that. But that's something that's not, 2 and 3 are going to be for the other chapters, and I'm sure the discussants will touch upon them in their comments, especially Simon. So why spend so much time on growth? Of course, you grow up in India from the 70s onwards, our adult life. One of the dominant debates, both in terms of substance and personalities, has been between Jagdish Bhagwati and Amartya Sen. One being associated with the pro-growth camp, the other with the equity camp, or focus on social outcomes, social policy, etc. And I think one of the themes of the book is going to be that, because India's democracy was weak, with precocious, with relatively weak accountability mechanisms, because society was so hierarchical, and because the state had somewhat limited agency and ability to act, it turns out that growth assumed a surprising causal primacy. And this is going to run into many chapters of the book. It changed the dynamic of education, which we're going to cover elsewhere. It actually, the irony of ironies is that the neoliberal state became the welfare state, the caring state, as it were. It changed the political economy of implementation. It accelerated internal migration and therefore, had implications for nation building. Devesh, in some of his earlier work, has also shown how it facilitated social change. So in some ways, growth has been very important. And above all, I think, if you remember Naipaul's 3 trilogies, Area of Darkness, Wounded Civilization, and India of a Million Mutinies, I think this sense of possibility in India, from woundedness and grievance to aspiration, mutinous aspiration as it were, could not have been possible without growth taking off after the 1980s and the enormous opportunities that it opened up. So I think growth is absolutely vital to understanding all the things that happened in India. So what is the 75-year record of growth? This is from the Madison cross-country table, 1950 to 2022, GDP per capita. India starts off, the colonial inheritance is pretty bad, pretty much at the bottom, 79th percentile. That's, if there were 100 countries, India's 79. And over 75 years, it's a pretty modest improvement from 79 to 66. So average standards of living rise by about 7.5 times. But if we take China, Korea, Taiwan, even Indonesia, the multiples are much greater. And this is the record that I think we want to analyze in the book. So the focus of this chapter is on the 4 eras. There's the planning era, which saw pretty weak per capita GDP growth. This is the famous Hindu growth. Then we had a brief period where growth started rising. This is the focus of the piece that Danny and I wrote, where suddenly growth takes off before the reform. And then we have the neoliberal era from 1991, when after the crisis, radical reforms took place, until the global financial crisis, and India boomed per capita GDP growth 4.5%, amongst the highest in the world. And post-global financial crisis, the data are contested, and that's going to be critical to understanding, I think, what went wrong. So just to sharpen this and slightly exaggerate this, everything's misunderstood, we're going to pose this in terms of what did the left say about each period, and what did the right say, and why were they kind of both slightly off. That's the way we want to present this chapter, just to sharpen it a little bit. As you can see, the 75-year record, the first 30 years cross-country is actually terrible. India deteriorated in relative terms from 79th to 85th. So the first 30 years are, in fact, were a poor performance. But you'll be surprised at how the left interpreted this growth performance.
And China was below India.
China much below India to begin with, but then and despite going to the Great Leap Forward, it caught up. We'll come to that later. So for this era, the one big takeaway, the mischaracterization, the interesting thing is that both the left and the right, if you see their writings, they disagree on the performance itself. Amartya Sen, Pranab Bardhan, Sukumar Chakravarti all say not bad at all given the circumstances. That's their take on it. The right, of course, is the received wisdom, terrible planning, control, Raj, it was very bad. But the interesting thing is that they both agree that this was a regime of import substitution. Every textbook in India will tell you that the first 30 years was import substitution, and we're going to argue that that's off because it was a scarcity era, not an import substitution era. Why? Of course, import substitution, you keep out foreigners, but then you have 3 other economic agents in the economy. The public sector was favored, as Devesh is going to tell you, but highly inefficient, which also added to the cost of production. So you got inefficiency and scarcity because of that. You had the small private sector heavily favored through a whole range of policies, including in the limit some sectors where only the small, some of the highly internationally competitive labor intensive sectors were reserved until 2000. So they were favored, but they were kind of intrinsically rendered inefficient because you would get all these things only if you remained small. So if you achieved scale, you would lose that, so there was a strong incentive. And then I think the most unique aspect of the first 30 years, which really distinguished India from all the other prototype import substitution things, is the stifling, absolute throttling of the domestic private sector. Remember, import substitution and protectionism is about favoring the domestic economy, whether public or private, but India created a system where you throttle the domestic private sector, so the net result of all this was in fact scarcity. And just to give you so one of the things in the book that Devesh and I have tried very hard to do is to try and present for anything data over 75 years. It's all new primary administrative data. We want to present this over 75 years. Of course, you see that in the first 30 years, very high black market premium. This is from the data set that Reinhardt and Rogoff have compiled. And this is new data that we show that in the first 30 years, the share of income reported to the tax authorities very low to begin with, and at the end of the planning era, it went from 7 to 3%. So it was, so it was really a scarcity economy. Now we move to the next phase. Again, the phase that was the left calls this the phase of public investment-led growth. The right says it's unsustainable Keynesianism because there was a massive expansion which led to the crisis of 1991, and so they kind of they dismiss it on those grounds. The left extols it on grounds that it was public investment-led. But actually what Danny and I said was this was an era where you saw pro-business reform rather than pro-market reform. And in fact, it was the first era of import substitution, because in this era, the big policy change that began to happen was that the restrictions on the domestic private sector, licensing, their access to imports, started to be liberalized gradually. And India, it used to be called internal liberalization before external liberalization, but essentially, yeah?
So in other countries which are doing import substitution, industrialization, not do this type of scarcity?
Yeah, there are no restrictions on the domestic private sector. I mean, the whole point of import substitution, I mean, Korea did just the opposite, in fact. You know, you had to get all these things provided you could do well. And essentially, licensing gets progressively relaxed, access to inputs get relaxed, and therefore you get you start growth taking off. And in a sense, the two key things which make it an import substitution regime is that productivity takes off because of the elimination of the production tax, but trade doesn't take off. If it were a pro-competition reform, you would see much more trade, and you see trade to GDP, even in the 80s, is basically flat. It's only after the reforms in 91, which is pro-competition, that you see trade contributing to economic growth. Third, now we come to the third, 91 reforms, everyone knows the story, but I think we've missed something really essential about this. The left tends to say neoliberal as pejorative. The right hails this as reforms-led growth. But I think for us, what is really new about this is that you had East Asian outcomes on trade. I'll show you. India was the third largest exporter in growth of manufacturing during this, not just services, manufacturing during this era. So we got East Asian outcomes on trade. And Danny and others will be the current crowd are going to be very disappointed. We got this without any East Asian policies. No industrial policy, no export subsidies, no undervalued exchange rate, three real hallmarks of East Asian industrial policy. We got those outcomes. And the second thing, of course, is that we got the East Asian outcomes on growth, but we got very little formal employment creation, very little manufacturing jobs, formal sector manufacturing jobs, and this is the whole India's pattern being more skill intensive than high skill intensive, rather low intensive. You see trade and investment take off in this period, and India, this annual average growth of exports, goods and services and manufacturing, India was the third fastest. Between 95 and 2020, India is the third fastest growing, both manufacturing exports and this.
But on a low base. The denominator was low, no?
But China, from a very high base, was doing 13% as well. So I think that annual average growth is still, over these long periods of time, is quite important. Because Vietnam, Bangladesh is also slow base. So unlike in East Asia, we didn't get it. So it was boringly, defiantly, flagrantly Washington consensus in spirit, not East Asian in spirit. And of course, you didn't get the structural transmission, which we, that's for another chapter. So in fact, this shows how India's composition of exports. Services did very well, high-skill manufacturing did well, but labor-intensive did relatively quite poorly, and that's why you didn't get the structural transformation, which we try to explain in another chapter. The last period, I think, is a real problem. The left and right, everyone is all over the place on the period after the global financial crisis. The left says it's flawed Modi government policies, demonetization. So if you read Kaushik Basu or Raghuram Rajan, they will target their attacks on the, and there were flawed policies. The right will say, no, lots of achievements under the Modi regime, and kind of both are right in some respects. The problem is that for the left, it's awkward. If you attack the policies, the government comes back and says, so what? Growth was 7%. What's your problem? What are you criticizing? The right's praise leads to the awkward. There was growth, but what's the story? And I'm going to show you there's growth, but nothing adds up to create a story. So therefore, the only possible interpretation is that I'm going to show you that the data is quite flawed, pretty flawed. And that growth was modest. It wasn't bad, it was modest. And the slowdown of growth happened classic Japanese style overhang. After the excesses of the 2010s, you had this too much lending, non-performing assets, too much borrowing, and all that process went into reverse. And that's why you had slowing down of growth. So this is the kind of chart I don't know why now China's GDP is under attack. By the way, the latest Indian GDP number that's come out is utterly incomprehensible, which we can talk about later. But this is the India changed its methodology for post-global. I just want you to absorb this, that the black bars are annual average rates of growth for any macro indicator you want to take. And they're all double, 15% real annual average. After 2011, everything collapses by about 10, 12 percentage points. So just to give you one example, take exports. It was growing at 16% nearly every year, dollar real terms between this, and it became 4%. So everything collapses. We have new data on assets, on earnings, but GDP stands resilient, immune to all the changes, and you get this sort of picture. And so, this is the high stress and the high corporate stress, and you get the classic balance sheet symptoms. You get credit to GDP, which soared, flattened out, and investment to GDP soared, and then collapsed because of the deleveraging process, and therefore, and so the contention here is that, the diagnosis is contaminated by the fact that people are not, kind of coming to grips with the data. It's also been contaminated by politicization. I think with the Modi government coming into power, intellectual discourse itself has become more polarized, so people pick and choose what they want to attack. But I think also there's a profound intellectual sociology going on about this, is that every Indian macroeconomist can only think in terms of conventional macro crises, because all of India's crises in the past, 66, 80, 91, 2013, were either crises because food, fuel, fiscal, finance, something going wrong. This is the first time that there was a kind of a slow bleed of a crisis where you didn't get the big disruptive macro crisis, you got the slow bleed, and just so as I like to say, familiarity breeds contempt, and unfamiliarity impedes understanding. So this is kind of the situation of the fourth era. So yeah.
What is different here, Arvind? So what specifically is different from the food, fiscal, finance?
So those are all major. Those were conventional. Shortage of food, exchange rate, prices go up, exchange rate collapse. Lack of foreign exchange because you had a fiscal thing, 1991. You get a major. So you get a major event driven by conventional macro factors. Here you didn't get a major event. There was no crisis. It was just a slow bleed, but then the slow bleed couldn't be detected because you said, oh, it's actually still growing at 7%. So the data contaminates the story. So all of these go wrong.
Can you say in your remaining 3-4 minutes, we'll take more minute. Can you tell us about the idea that is associated with you in India is what is this twin balance sheet crisis?
So just to,
which you say is the new macro crisis.
I mean, it's new for India. It's as old as history for other countries.
Japan and perhaps in China today.
China today, Japan,
Japan
and really many of the crises, Spain, Europe, etc., wherever there's been a large excess flow, which then kind of reverses what they call a sudden stop. In India, it didn't take the form of a crisis because we had foreign exchange and therefore the external situation was okay. But you did get this. So essentially what happens is in the 2010s, which is the boom era, you get this massive buildup of credit, growth, massive investment, and massive trade. So lending happens as if there's going to be no tomorrow, there's over-optimism. But then there's also a lot of shenanigans on lending associated with, the finance minister, the phone banking, all of that. So a combination of genuine over-optimism and kind of shenanigans leads you to rapid growth, which is classic symptom, a precursor to this. So what happens is that this happens, and then for a variety of reasons, the global financial crisis, the external economy slows down, and then all this gets reflected. In the 2010s, what happened in the 2010s, what happened in the aughts of all this stuff, you get rising NPAs, non-performing assets in the banking system peak at 12%. For public sector banks, it's 15%. Most of the lending, the borrowing was by infrastructure firms, the famous house of debt. And because of slowing growth and over borrowing, their interest cover ratio, that is, they have debt, how much of their interest is less than 1%. The interest coverage ratio, how much of your interest is covered by revenue, is less than 1%. So they basically have no money left beyond debt servicing. And so because of this, investment freezes. That's why you saw investment freezes, because in the aftermath, credit also freezes. And therefore, you get neither credit nor investment, which is a kind of natural follow-up of this. And that's the twin balance, because the twin balance sheets, because bank balance sheets, there's too many NPAs. Firm's balance sheet, there's too much debt. And therefore,
so basically, it will hurt investment.
And
investment will go down.
Yeah, investment will go down, and credit banks will be unwilling to lend as well. Both things will happen. Yeah. So in a sense, therefore, the conclusion is, and obviously, we're kind of exaggerating, but you can see that every phase is genuinely misunderstood. We thought we had import substitution. We actually had scarcity. We thought we had, unsustainable Keynesianism. We had rapid productivity growth without trade. In the third phase, we all knew growth was gangbusters, but we had East Asian outcomes without East Asian policies, East Asian outcomes without East Asian structural transformation. The last period completely contaminated by bad data. And it's really sad because now in India, I spell it out in the chapter. Essentially now, I've showed you contaminated GDP data from 2011 onwards. This government even more politicized. The backcasting from 2004-5. So this is there's a paper in the Journal of Political Economy saying dictators overstate growth. Rubbish. There are very clever quasi-dictators like Mr. Modi who overstate the growth when they are in power and massively understate the growth in the previous regime so that they can look good. And that was the explicit aim of this. So Indian data now, apart from GDP, for 20 years is unusable. From 2004 to today, it's kind of now, at least asterisk, but otherwise misleading. So growth is very important. In the rest of the book, we're going to show that it has had enormous consequences. But if
I'm using the term structural transformation in the standard development theory sense, migration from agriculture to industry, manufacturing to services, and more and more employment created outside agriculture.
So it's a good question. Yeah. The key thing, I think the key infirmity, as it were, or in terms of the outcome we care about, is employment creation.
Right.
But that's related to other pathologies, which is not getting enough people to get jobs in formal manufacturing, not enough people leaving agriculture, not being competitive in global export markets in labor-intensive commodities, which is what will give you the job creation and so on. So all these related pathologies lead to this big outcome that we care about, inadequate formal sector jobs, and we call all of this structural transformation.
Which happened, and that structural transformation happened in Korea, in Japan.
See, and just remember,
China, most spectacularly China.
In sub-Saharan Africa, the question doesn't even arise because growth was so poor, there's no question. But in a set of countries, growth happened, and India was kind of a unique country which had the growth, but not the structural transformation.
So, just a quick question, very earthily. If India has now leapfrogged, this is in some kind of comparative historical terms, the role of manufacturing in the development economy. Has the frog died? I mean, is there going to be any way of making up these gaps, in particular with respect to?
Can we reserve this for the open discussion?
Because it's a very important question, and we'll come back. So this is kind of the conclusion. So the next chapter is about what happened in the planning era and why the left was quite wrong in its assessment. And we spent a lot of time on two new explanations, which is how agriculture did and how I didn't do well enough compared to the East Asian countries, and then licensing. And the third one is going to exactly analyze that. So
Arvind, let me ask you, and let me ask Simon also. Should we have Simon comment on you now or
whatever? I mean, whatever you guys want. I mean,
let's do that. Let's have Simon comment on you now, right? So Simon Johnson is the first commentator, and then we'll have Devesh's presentation and Yashin's commentary. Simon Johnson is the Ronald Kurtz Professor of Entrepreneurship at the MIT School of Management, and he has served as Chief Economist of the International Monetary Fund. And what else should you know? You should know that his most recent book with Darren Akimoglu is Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity. There is quite a bit else that one can list, but in the interest of time, let's have his commentary for 15 minutes on the growth chapter.
Okay. Thank you very much for the opportunity to read this fascinating book that I'm sure is going to be very important. It's certainly long awaited, so there's a lot of really interesting insights in the book. Many of my reactions I'll share directly with the authors, including relatively minor points. Let me just focus on a couple of bigger picture issues. So when economists talk about growth, and this is obviously, Arvind showed you a version of this picture, we always show you log GDP per capita, in purchasing power parity terms, typically. And everybody nods and says, yes, obviously that's the right thing to look at. And this does give you a very straightforward way to think about growth. Remember, however, a couple of caveats that come directly out of Arvind's many years of work, including what he said at the end, which is, you know, GDP statistics are a pretty complicated thing, and you can game them, and over time the political incentives to game them may change, and you can go back and restate them. And that's before I start to talk about purchasing power parity, which involves a lot of surveys of prices and potential manipulation of that. But what we have in the data, this is from the Penn World Tables, which is absolutely standard source, is exactly as the authors say, a situation when the invaders have been evicted. Two countries, and I'm going to highlight China and India, because actually when you read the chapter, I think the book is obviously about India, but I think China gives you this very important reference point for it. How did India do? Was India's performance a little bit disappointing? Did they catch up with China? And so I think that's how it struck me when I read the chapter. So at the beginning, they start out both pretty poor. Now there's some upward drift, which is a little hard to see because they do better later, but there is some definite upward drift, but honestly, not very much, and this is part of what Arvind said, and both countries have their own, let's say, messed up policies, I think is pretty fair, own versions of that. From around, obviously, 1978, 1980, China finds itself on a different growth path, so you see an acceleration of growth here. India takes longer to get there. So that seems like one reasonable interpretation, and that is the standard view of this. And by the way, and I will talk about levels, and this is also, I have 40 slides, which I don't propose to show them all, some of them for the authors. You know, if we step back and look at levels of GDP per capita, they're going to be able to, it'll help us make a couple of interesting comparisons later on. Won't dwell on that now. So, did China miss an opportunity? Did India miss an opportunity, right? So maybe there was a difficult period after the foreigners have gone. China gets itself sorted out. India perhaps now is catching up. If it's not catching up with China, why not? This is a question that's asked a lot. I would say, very important, and I think this is actually missing from the chapters I saw, that you need to discuss the demographics and what happened to population, because clearly all developing countries were hit by this very big, we can call it a shock, this epidemiological transition after World War II. So a lot more people were born, a lot more children were born and survived to adulthood than ever before in any set of countries. That has to be a difficult problem for anyone to overcome, particularly at those income levels. So the numbers are dramatic. However, of course, after 1980, when both countries improve in per capita, there's also a large increase in population. So it's not that the population plays a decisive role, and there must be a demographic dividend at some point for every country. The children become young adults, they work, they earn income, and I think you could deal with that a bit more than you do. In any case, the World Bank absolutely says, and I have checked this, so it must be true, right? The World Bank has said that Chinese economic success was unprecedented. That's one of their favorite words. And the Wall Street Journal has some good things to happen too. So if the Wall Street Journal and the World Bank agree, you know you're in serious trouble. And India has reform, absolutely no question. Now, did the decisive reform start in 1980 or start in 1991? You can read multiple Arvind papers on this and just decide which Arvind paper you prefer. It's all in there somewhere. It's a little hard to see, little hard to say, but India did fall behind China. And so here's what success looks like. Here is a faster growth rate. This is, if we start India, if you say, let's start India in 1950, we use traditional Indian green here. We'll use India in 1980, we have a nice brown color here. India is sort of a blue color here. And these are the, if I have just start reform or attempting to grow in different dates, this is what the path looks like. And actually that's not China, that's South Korea. Now, what if I add China? Oops.
Just click, hit the...
Sorry.
Just, yeah, click on the.
Yeah, that's not
Next.
No, what is it?
Yeah.
Simon.
There. So if I add China, actually China is of course red. That's the color. China should be in all PowerPoint slides. China's performance is actually not that impressive compared to Korea. And India, interestingly enough, and this is, you can see this in the chapter, but I think it's a little hidden. So this is India after, if I take 1991, for example, you've got to be a little bit careful with starting points. I mean, we're very good at playing games with statistics. But it's very easy to have the India line look very much like the Chinese line after 1978. So maybe India just was a bit slow to get its act together. And okay.
I mean, you could
This-
say
this-
that
this-
India was 10 years behind.
So this
India
is-
began in 1991, whereas China starts taking off in 1980, 4 years after Mao.
So this is Wall Street Journal, 2015. A very nice set of slides there's a set of pictures that I carry with me always, which say exactly this. They say if you look at, they call it years since liberalization. That's a good Wall Street Journal word. So if you look at GDP per capita, exports of goods and services, foreign direct investment, percent of GDP, domestic investment equivalent, you can draw pictures in which India looks like China with a lag of 15, a little bit less than 15 years in the Wall Street Journal picture. So maybe that's the story. Maybe you have to find your way to this development growth path and you adopt the Chinese, not exactly the Chinese way, every country is obviously different. But I don't know if any of you are fans of the old TV detective show, Columbo. So Columbo's distinctive, the sort of canonical Columbo moment is when the case looks entirely convincing and the guilty person, you know who the guilty person is, they're going to escape completely unscathed. And Columbo walks out, but he turns back and he says, and this is like a cigar, he says, there's just one more thing. And it turns out there's a very, very small, trivial thing that's just bugging him, right? And he starts to ask about that and get answers, and he pulls on that string and the whole thing unravels. So here's my, and by the way, I think that economists, who, of course, I love all economists, and all economists love data, and I love all data. But we tell ourselves the most weird stories, right? We tell ourselves, we put this structure on it, and the thing that's been bothering me is, Japan was a low-wage country in the 1960s. We know this for sure. Among other great anecdotes, Nike started by making low-cost footwear in Japan. 1960s. In the 1970s, they were not making very much footwear, and I'm sure they were not making low-cost footwear in the 1980s. Absolutely not. So, here's what's bothering me. China has had this remarkable success. It's definitely in the data. We can see it in the GDP, and I'm not disputing that, but China is still the manufacturing hub of the world, based in part on relatively low labor costs. Now, it's not the lowest labor cost in the world. Labor costs have risen. We'll talk about that. Wages have risen. But it has a position in global production. And you know this because we needed them for masks. Yashing and I know this very well. That's where all the PPE was, the personal protective equipment during COVID. Many supply chains today, if you talk about geopolitics, many supply chains run through China, including the low labor cost element of those supply chains. So how is it possible that China has had this amazing runaway success, and yet we still rely on them globally as this low labor cost producer? What would Eric Hobsbawm say? That's just thrown in for Arvind, who loves literary historical references. So only he will know what Eric Hobsbawm will say. But if you dig into this and you pull on this string...
What would he say? What would Hobsbawm say?
He was a Marxist, and he would say, let's look at power, and let's look at who has power and what they're doing with power, which we're going to do in a moment. So in my remaining few minutes, let me pull on that string. So let's say that we don't believe GDP per capita data, GDP data. And Arvind's book is going to be pretty devastating on the Indian data, so I think that's pretty reasonable. What other information do we have? Well, actually, we do have pretty good independent or not derived in the same way information on wages. So wages is something that's observed directly. It's observed by the ILO. Richard Freeman and his co-author Austin did a great job of putting together data from the ILO data set. Now, we don't have China before 1990, but we do know from other things that the Chinese-Indian pattern was not too different in this earlier period. And what we do see here, absolutely, is wages. This is what is called low-skilled, and of course low-skilled changes over time. We've got to be careful about that. But what's classified in the ILO data is low-skilled workers' wages. And all I'm doing here, actually, I'm not doing anything. All we're doing from the ILO data is we're taking a nominal wage and we're using a market exchange rate. Not a PPP. There's no consumption basket complications and games. What's the market exchange rate? Now, market exchange rates don't tell me exactly how much you can buy, but they're very informative if I think about foreign investors or think about your position in global supply chains. So China definitely has, and that's my water. That's my oven. Put it back. Put it back. Get your oven.
But I'm still yours, son.
All right, fine. South Korea. Now, look, if I had more time, I'd do a lot more countries and we could do this. But, for the purpose of this discussion, let's just think about South Korea. Actually, I'll talk about a couple of other countries further on. So South Korea has, as you all know, a pretty dismal economic experience until the early 1960s. And then it has its period of reforms. And let me be completely agnostic what reform. I don't know what reforms are. I think but there are something changes about South Korean policy. Now, wages, the low skill, do not rise right away, but by 1985, 1990, 1995, we can see a significant gap here. And we're seeing something also very interesting, which is South Korea seems to be doing something dramatically different from India and China, if you draw it on this scale. Now, maybe skill is complicating things. So let's think about manufacturing. Manufacturing is, with appropriate deference to the point made about manufacturing versus services, manufacturing is the core of how you think about competitiveness and what you can do, what you can produce globally. So here's China and India again, and in manufacturing, Chinese wages absolutely do go up. Indian wages are rising down here, but Chinese wages go up earlier. And here's South Korean manufacturing wages. So South Korea's GDP per capita advantage, by the way, is about 3-to-1 compared to China in 1985. You can't see it in this picture easily. It's about 3-to-1 today, so we can think about whether that's meaningful. But the wage difference is 5-to-1. The wage gap has opened South Korea. Now, on democracy, we all know the story, and we're not going to spend too much time on it. But we know that India had a remarkable and amazing and unusually democratic, which you might want to complain about. But honestly, guys, this stands out, globally. Right? And now we've got some deterioration. China's democratization, well, it does actually go down after Tiananmen Square. You can't even see it because it's so bottom. It's basically bottom coded in these data. The Korean story is, of course, a different one, and much more the standard story, I would say, of European industrialization, which is, you start to build stuff, the middle class makes a lot of money. This is Eric Hobsbawm's story. They don't pay the workers any money. I can promise you that. My family is from middle class in the north of England. We didn't pay them any decent wages until we were forced to. By the rise of trade unions, by politicization, by political representation, in the same story in Korea, right? So the democratic transition now, you can argue democracy versus industrialization, chicken and egg, fine. But this is a very different pattern. So, what's the top 20% look like relative to the bottom 20% in these countries? Now, this is a ratio. All I need to do is measure your nominal incomes. I don't need to do anything with prices. There's no exchange rates in here. It's just a ratio, right? The prices, PPP numbers, if that's your origin, they just drop out. So here, this is interesting. And this, I think that, I think it's fascinating, Arvind.
You're showing China as more unequal. The red line. The ratio of top 20 versus, with respect to bottom 20, China is more unequal.
Yes, in these data. The World Inequality Database, absolutely. So this is what I mean about stories and labels. We had this label, socialism. Well, it's obviously, capitalism with Chinese characteristics, if I can call it. I'm sure that that's absolutely true. But we had this idea that, look, the Chairman Mao, he was all about, in the Cultural Revolution, it was going to be more equal, right? I mean, China, I don't put it on here because their data's a bit, China is more unequal than Russia. All the stories you know about Russia and Russian growth are also wrong. You can do your next book on that one, okay? So China is more unequal than Russia. China is more unequal than India, although Indian inequality has gone up a lot. But look, maybe this is just what happens. Maybe we can't avoid more inequality with growth.
Simon, you have 3 minutes left.
Korea.
Okay.
Korean inequality.
Comes down.
Wait, well, it goes up a little bit, but it's not doing this, right? So India and China, if I just look at the data, and I put away the labels and I put away the narratives, I'm thinking, okay, so what's the difference between India and China exactly? I mean, yes, you got some stories there. You can also do this for the pre-tax income. You can do this with PPP adjustment or not for people at the low end. Now, it's absolutely true, poverty in China has come down a lot. Extreme poverty, probably been eliminated. India poverty has come down a lot. I mean, that's what all the sources say. Yeah, well, exactly, including the World Bank. But wages at the bottom have gone up, bottom 20%. This is trying to calculate exactly, the purchasing power of the bottom 20%. But again, the South Koreans have done better. the bottom line here is, if you looked at British industrial history in the early 19th century, you would, or spent a lot of time with it, you would not expect a process in which the middle class makes money and then everybody benefits. Actually, the middle class makes a lot of money and nobody else benefits. That characterizes Britain until, well after the Chartists. So you've got 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, which the prosperity is not greatly shared. Now, Chinese, we could spend a lot of time thinking about China. I think it gets harder and harder to sustain this Chinese model without a lot of surveillance and a lot of monitoring and a lot of persuasion. Your cognitive class definitely becomes more prosperous. They don't really care about wages of workers. They just don't want revolution. India is obviously different, but the lack of progress at the low end, guys, is really striking to me. And when I read your chapter, I'm like, I want to understand this more. There's a disappointment or a similarity, and it's not bad. I mean, China has grown, India has grown, but there's something similar there. And we can talk about what the mechanism is, and this is more for the authors. But here's my last question, which is, why do we say you want to be like China? I want to be like Japan. According to the data, I'm just looking at the data, Japan was a poor country. This is India, China, and Japan. Observationally hard to tell which is which at the beginning of this period. Okay, so China's gone through some disruption to understand, but it's not like China bounces back after World War II and is suddenly ahead of them. No, there's a very long period of growth, and then there's a sustained increase with bumping around and balance sheet crises and whatever you want to call them. But China becomes rich. Why don't you want to become rich? Don't become like China. Become rich, like Japan. And Japan, this is the United States, which obviously didn't start at the same wage level that we have now. And this is hourly wages. Again, trying to strip out anything else, just using market exchange rates. I mean, what Japan achieved is to reach, roughly speaking, the wage level of the United States. Right? This is where India and China are now. So where's my Chinese economic miracle? And what should India aim for? What's the aspiration here, guys? Because I think this book is an important, not just retrospective, but setting of the goalposts. And then there's another 20 slides of appendices and mathematical derivations and data sources for these guys.
The big point you want to make is that India is simply 10 or 15 years behind China, that's it. Is that the point?
Well, it might be, but being 10 to 15 years behind China, is that a good thing? Is that your aspiration? Is that what you want? Is that defined success?
So there's an empirical point here, and by bringing in South Korea and Japan, you are saying that India-China comparison, even if you say that India is 10 to 15 years behind, then it's basically not very different. But India could be thinking of Japan and South Korea as a way to grow.
Yeah, I don't think.
As a way to grow.
I think limiting your.
Is that what you like?
I think limiting your hopes and expectations to the Chinese path seems unnecessary and not particularly a good idea. Whether I mean, look, I think China has grown. I mean, I'm saying this with Yashing sitting next to me, so with great interpretation. But I think China has grown with a huge amount of suppression of labor. If the British industrialists had their dream, they would have done what China has done, right? Which is the middle class gets rich and the workers stay, squeezed. Extreme poverty may have been eliminated at the same time, but there's a set of workers there who have not done particularly well. I'm not sure that's what India wants to do or can.
Labor share GDP tanked.
In China.
Yeah.
So that's consistent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If I heard this correctly, it almost seems as if you're making a broader point for saying where did this idea of the Chinese economic miracle come from? And should we, independent, is that the kind of aspirational model, whether for India or for other countries? And I almost feel like I want to ask, how did it become the economic model, and why is it that we're not paying attention to the Japanese or the South Korean developmental model? And is there a kind of political story there?
Okay, so let's discuss it also in the open session. So Devesh will present the PSUs, the public sector, SOEs in China and PSUs in India. That chapter, which has a lot of new data, I think. Yes. It also has estimate of how much PSUs have hurt India.
Thanks. So one of the sort of interesting things is that as a grad student, student, at that time, there was a lot of interest and work on state-owned enterprises. But basically, last few decades, you'll never see almost any work in political science or economics on state-owned enterprises, partly because you can't do RCTs or you can't randomly shut down a state-owned enterprise. But it's curious why it is that work has completely vanished, even though they continue to be pretty important in a host of countries. Now,
Just click, Devesh, click on the next on the arrow.
Yes, just click on next.
Yeah, that works.
oh, sorry.
Yeah, there you go.
So, we know that for a host of this sort of development path post-war, countries used a mix of these four sort of instruments. Trade policy, in India's case, licensing, and directed finance by controlling the financial sector. And the fourth was state-owned enterprises. Now, in the Indian case, what we'll show you is that state-owned enterprises, with some exceptions, they consistently have delivered poor financial returns. In the case of subnational state enterprises, which is, the states have their own, the performance, if at the central level was poor, at the state level was simply terrible. That the opportunity costs have been very substantial and have been an important factor, we believe, why funds for core infrastructure and human capital were much less than ought to have been. And this is also one reason why the story of India's structural transformation has been much weaker. Now, we know the story in sort of Nehru's India. State-owned enterprises would hold the commanding heights of the economy, the temples of modern India, et cetera, et cetera. But India was not an exception. I mean, this was true worldwide. It's not just the Soviet Union and China, but Europe, East Asia, Latin America. Now, in most other places, state-owned enterprises were ubiquitous in utilities, mining, energy, transport. Where India and some other countries, we'll see, were different was the importance of state-owned enterprises in the manufacturing sector. So this is just last 50 years. And there are a few things you want to see is that the capital employed in state-owned enterprises actually jumps massively after liberalization. 30 times in nominal terms and about 8 times in real terms. The second is that the number of employees actually drops substantially even as the capital has increased massively. State-owned enterprises and the entire Indian state has been cutting down its employees pretty steadily and quietly. What that has meant, of course, is that, or not necessarily, but you see in core central government enterprises, the productivity has been sort of increasing steadily in the past 3 decades. As is, one of their goals was employment, state-owned enterprises combined were never more than 1% of the labor force. But as a part of the formal organized sector, they peaked at about 6%, but really are a pretty small part. In the case of the states, which is at the subnational level, what we see is that in this case, you do see a decline relative, whereas at the central level, we've seen an increase.
In investment.
Yeah.
You have the same figures for the capital stock, like what the...
Yeah, so now This is the share of the public sector in value added, maximum in mining and finance. Finance because we nationalized all the banks. The overall share, you'll see, was never more than a fifth. And that's because agriculture is a big part of the economy. Manufacturing, it was never more than about 15%. And that's partly because India, a huge part of manufacturing is in the informal sector. So where you see is that as a share of the economy, it was never a dominant part of the economy. It was an important part. But if you look at the performance, this is the rate of return on capital employed. Now, this is particularly important, which is the steel sector. Steel was massively capital intensive. And this was the sector where the maximum amount of the government of India's investments in manufacturing were to the steel plants. And they almost never made, until way out in the 2010s, their rate of return was negative almost consistently, despite this huge amount. Now, of course, oil companies generally, because you're extracting, they were profitable. Telecom was, we start here because you didn't have state-owned enterprises. It was part of the ministry. So there's a legal thing of which ones are, they were spun off as a state-owned enterprises in the late 80s. Until the private sector, until there were monopolies, they were making good. Then when the private sector began to come in, you see a huge sort of decline in profitability. Now this is, we've put together the rate of return relative to the opportunity cost over 50 years. So you can look at the opportunity cost relative to the government, to the borrowing rate, which is the GSEC rate, which is this, or the prime lending rate, which is the State Bank of India, India's biggest bank, which is the rate it offers to its best customers, right? So the opportunity cost, this is the gap. If you see it relatively to the GSEC rate, and this is the gap if you see it relative to the prime lending rate. Right? And I think it's pretty obvious the gap was massive consistently over the past 50 years. It begins to come down somewhat in the past 20 years. Liberalization was helpful. It made state-owned enterprises a bit more competitive. We can't do the same thing for the states because there is just, the states don't even produce the accounts of many of these companies. They're so bad. But we've focused on three where you have the maximum losses, which is state electricity boards, state road transport corporations, and, which is the small one. This one is the irrigation, because all the dams in India, so what steel was to the central government, dams were for the states. The dams were never built by the central government. They were all built by states.
Including Bhakra?
The exceptions were Bhakra and Hirakud. So, and dams are extremely capital intensive. So just the financial losses, I'm not talking of opportunity cost here, rose to about 4.5% of GDP, which is a massive amount. If you take these numbers over both the center and the states, right, the average opportunity costs were about 5% of GDP over basically half a century. For the center, because the central government spends more on infrastructure, it was about 1.5 times of all central government spending on infrastructure. For state governments, because education and health are state subjects, it was about 75% of all spending on education and health over 50 years. That's a massive amount in terms of the opportunity cost, and we can see why both infrastructure and human capital was so underfunded. Now,
Can you understand this a little bit? What is like, you mean to say, and I have noticed that in the chapter, you mean to say that all India growth hit is 5%.
yeah, so
No, that's not the way to read it.
No.
When you say opportunity cost, if socialist business were not there, growth would be
no, not growth.
not growth. GDP would be 5% higher.
Yeah, so it's the level.
GDP level,
Yeah.
it's not rate, level,
Yeah.
would be 5% higher.
Yeah.
Yeah, because returns would be, so if all of this went as profits, you would just have 5% higher consistently level of GDP because of this. Think of it as the lost inefficiency, the lost GDP due to inefficiency of the public sector.
Okay.
So what you can see is that around the late 80s, right?
Sorry, can I just understand this again? So if the level would have been 5% higher in any given year, then you're saying the growth rate would have also been 5 percentage points higher, right?
No, so just speak here. So every year, it's every year 5% of GDP less return you get. So at every year there's the level would have been 5% higher over the previous year.
Then you can calculate the growth.
Then you can calculate
whatever the implication of the rate is.
So that means, no, but does that mean that in the 1950s, when you have the Hindu rate of growth, the true rate of growth would have been 6.5% rather than...
I mean, you have to do the numbers just. Yeah. So it would be substantially higher, yeah.
So
You can calculate the numbers. Yeah. I mean,
Let's just say substantially higher.
yeah, 5% level every year.
See, and the important thing is it's that over half century.
But that's a very large number.
That is.
Meaning it's kind of almost too high.
So we come just hold that, yeah. So what you see is this shift, right? The state, there's a reason where, if all of you know India in the 80s, the infrastructure was so bad because you were investing all the state, the central government was putting all the money in manufacturing. There's a reason that infrastructure in India has improved because now you switched, right, from investments in manufacturing to investments in infrastructure. And this is sort of the point that Arvind was making was this we sort of argue in other chapters played a role on why India's structural transformation has not occurred. Basically, the share of the labor force in manufacturing has stagnated.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So in the infrastructure, coal and steel would not count as infrastructure.
Sorry?
Coal and steel would not count as infrastructure,
No.
they count as manufacturing
Yeah.
in your
Yeah. So coal is under mining.
But they're part of the calculation because state enterprise, part of the.
They're part of state enterprises, but infrastructure is power. So infrastructure is power. It is
Roads.
telecom, roads, and railways.
What is
And
manufacturing?
ports.
So transport. So manufacturing is a separate. So manufacturing is steel. Then heavy electricals, heavy engineering.
I think he's asking where mines would be. Where mining.
Mining would not be
Mining-
manufacturing.
In the first chart, coal is part of mining. In the
See,
first chart.
this chart.
No, in your manufacturing thing, because you said that steel accounts for a large fraction of the manufacturing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to understand how the 50% figure that you just showed, the red line,
Right.
Which red line?
sorry, maybe it's the black.
So most of the investment in manufacturing,
Yeah. So
all this occurs because we are starting here in 71. Almost the dominance of steel in investment is from the 60s and 70s. Because remember the steel plants of Bokaro, Bhilai, etc., they're all built from the late 50s to the 70s. After that, the steel, you see a turnaround, etc. So that hugely drops.
So that's what happens. So the red line story is the steel story.
Yeah.
And infrastructure story is the other story.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Infrastructure is going up, steel and heavy electricals going up, right? And HMD and etc.
Yeah.
All that.
All
HMD doesn't exist anymore.
So So we understand, I don't have to belabor about why these were created, the usual arguments, right? The perception of market failures, a big domestic capitalist class, limited interest by foreign capital, etc. Now, we want to add that, look, we believe that they had some positive, somewhat inadvertent, that was not planned. One of the things we show how state-owned enterprises help to build a middle class, albeit small, among the marginalized groups. And you see among, say, the managerial class, you see for SC/ST, the ST figures are about the same. They are now proportionate to the share of the population, and they were completely absent, 50 years ago. So there have been these positive sort of effects, but they are very limited. Now, there's a whole sort of thing on why performance was so poor. One of these, things that we want to just point out because it's rarely, because, the usual thing is patronage, this, that. That is definitely part of the story, but it's not. We don't think it's the driver of the story. One of the things that, for instance, given the importance of steel at that time, what you see is that these state-owned enterprises never had people who knew how to run a firm. They were all largely ICS officers. Someone who was running health tomorrow is running a steel plant. So the Indian administrative service played a terrible role. There's no doubt about this. It has many strengths. But there was a lot of essential self-dealing. There were no professional managers who knew about commerce, about enterprise. And the biggest mistake India made was not about getting into steel. It had a comparative advantage, iron ore, coal, but starting 3 steel plants simultaneously. So what happened was, till the 60s, India was graduating more lawyers than engineers. Actually, so you just didn't have the managers, the technical person, even, these reports point out, even a major power like US or Japan could not start 3 large steel plants simultaneously and have the personnel.
I see.
So that you really see there was so much inexperience. If they had done it sequentially, this would have had much better chance because you would have created the technical manpower and expertise. But that is what they do create over 30, 40 years. So when the private sector starts, their personnel are drawn from the public sector steel plants because they have essentially now built up expertise after 30, 40 years. Now, despite I think the 2 points here we want to make is, one, the government of India was very well aware of the weaknesses. We are not exaggerating. We've read literally hundreds of reports, and these are not in the ministries, parliamentary committee reports, abundant awareness in Parliament about the problems and the weaknesses. The only group that continued to defend from outside was India's intellectuals. India's intellectual class.
The left, especially the left.
It is amazing how much, despite terrible performance year after year, despite this awareness that the defense of it continues well into, and a good example is Air India, which had $12 billion of losses, and yet an airline by definition is for the rich, it's not for the poor. But the defense that it could not be privatized because that would be neoliberal or whatever label you want to give it. It is true that labor became, because for organized labor, this was one of their key things, and so they were very reluctant to sort of change and things. One of the things we show is that because the Indian state went from heavy industry, it was very you had a very low female labor participation, because in most countries, heavy industry favors male workers. If they had gone much more for light industry, you would have had a greater chance of more women. So while it was good for SC/ST, the public sector had some of the lowest employment of women. Now, I think this is the one which.
3 minutes more.
Yeah, I'll just. That. Why is it that India's intellectuals were so deeply invested in state-owned enterprises? You can understand why the bureaucrats would be. You can understand why the politicians would be, lots of. But why were India's intellectuals so deeply invested? And that has continued. You will still find it very hard for a deeper saying, look, these enterprises are useless, they should be privatized. So even when privatization begins, everyone goes through verbal contortions not to call it privatization. Disinvestment, every word will be used, but not privatization, because that is simply politically impossible. And the question is why, right? What is it that you want to run when you know it is performing so poorly and you're hemorrhaging Reading that you can use those resources for other? That's a harder, I don't think as yet we have any explanation, frankly. The only thing we come to is that statism, what in Hindi there's a term called Mai Baap Sarkar, that is a very deeply embedded in the Indian psyche. It doesn't matter if you are left or right, regional party or caste-based party, every political party, every society itself has a deep statist bent. And that is, I think, the fundamental point behind the legitimacy that intellectuals believe, because society itself believes in this.
I'm just wondering, who are the intellectuals you're talking about? Can you just name it? Just random.
You take sort of anyone who works on economic development, we just try to see if they're ever written.
Just asking for names.
Take a person like Pranab Bardhan, take Amartya Sen.
Any more?
Right? So Sukumar Chakrabarti. So we are talking of, right? So even if you take, say, Amartya's books, fabulous work, you will not find in the whole book one paragraph on state-owned enterprises.
Or in Sukumar's famous development planning lecture.
Bardhan's famous book, which we all know.
But were they really that influential in policy making?
As the intellectual thing, that was meaning if you believe that changes in policy require intellectual sort of legitimation, in that sense. Imagine if they were all saying, this is terrible, this has to change.
But then, I'm just thinking, you're talking about the parliamentary committees, and you're absolutely right, but there are like a lot of these parliamentary committees which are critiquing the states, starting from around the 60s, 70s, are the leftist. So if you look at this parliament, you're like...
No. So that's why I said...
That's interesting. So what I wanted to...
That's why I was saying, talking of the intellectuals, not the politicians.
So you talk about... So you're just making a distinction between left intellectual and left politician. That's useful.
A little further though I think that you're almost stopping short of saying what I think you should say, which is that the intellectuals, I think if you go further back in time, you look at people like, you were talking about the MIT link to India, you look at people like Vikram Sarabhai, you look at people like Homi Bhabha, I think that you do find that there is a kind of intellect, because India's political leaders think of themselves as intellectuals in a way. And so I do think that there is a way in which the Sen, the Sukumar Chakrabarti, the Pranab Bardhan are following a line of thinking. They're not emerging out of nowhere. That line of thinking does find itself more in kind of policy circles in the 50s and 60s, and then it changes such that you don't have like Mahalana Visas and the Homi Bhabas and the Sarabhais. So I do think there is something to what you're saying about the importance of ideas, and rather than limiting intellectuals to these kind of academics in US universities, you could actually take it back to the fact that in the 50s and 60s, a lot of these US trained academics were returning to India and found themselves in absolutely critical positions at a very formative time of India's development.
Yeah, so the only thing is in the 50s and 60s, it's more from LSE England.
Devesh,
Let's do that.
Yeah,
we should have this discussion.
Yeah.
And your answer to why the intellectual resistance to. So, Yashin Nuan is 30 years, I think. Yashin is a professor, IPOC Foundation Professor of Global Economics and Management at the Sloan School at MIT. And before MIT, he taught at the University of Michigan and Harvard Business School. Among the books that, I used 3 books in my class, Selling China, Capitalism, Capitalism, Chinese Characteristics, and the 2 chapters in the most recent book, Rise and Fall of the East. So, and he runs the India, China, and ASEAN lab at the Sloan School. And I think we are, he's studied Chinese political economy in detail, so we are looking forward to what he has to say from a comparative perspective. Chinese SOEs versus Indian, it's not called SOEs in India, whatever, public sector, PSUs, public sector undertakings. Indian PSUs and Chinese SOEs.
Okay, so but I think
15 minutes.
in the chapter it is also referred to as SOE as well. So let me just use that uniform phrase. Thank you for inviting me. Great pleasure in reading I was given 2 chapters, and I was asked to focus on the second one, but I read both. So I may also have some comments on the kind of broad themes. One of the consistently, what I believe the mistaken view about China and India is that they had a similar starting point in 1980 or 1990. That's true if you look at the World Bank data and all of that. Let me just give you some scattered, and then give you a more systematic data point. More scattered. So in 1965, the Indian life expectancy is roughly in the 40s. And in fact, in India, women, a man outlived women, which is a remarkable thing that you don't see in many, many other countries. China in 1965, the Chinese already lived up to 55 and 60. So China was already 10 years ahead of India in terms of life expectancy. You would sometimes do see some discrepancy between economic level and social achievement, but to have that larger gap in favor of China, it's just simply not believable that China had similar or even lower level of per capita GDP. A Japanese industrial delegation visited China in 1965. The conclusion of the industrial delegation is that Chinese industry, especially machinery, was about 5 years behind Japan. Right? So that's 1965. If you read Chris Miller's book on semiconductor, China was beginning to do semiconductor in 1964. Right? So just a few years after the United States. The communist regime, to some extent, they are using the Modi methodology, which is be very negative on the prior regime to showcase your own achievement. The communist government had an incentive to understate the economic development level before 1949. Right? So I think that's one reason. And the other reason is that Simon will know this because Simon studies socialist economies as well. In socialist economy, we used what is known as a material balance product thing, and which is not GDP. It doesn't include service sector at all. Right? So for a developing country, usually you have a very large service sector buying and selling things on the street. The Chinese economic data don't include any service sector, right? And when they reconstructed GDP, they try to get back at the back end estimate of what the service sector was in 1950s and 1960s and 1970s. Doing that in 1980s. I mean, you can just imagine how difficult that is. So I think that's also missing that. But the more systematic data comes from a paper, which is not very well known because it was published in an obscure journal, which is using the food consumption data to estimate the Chinese GDP in 1990. And they were comparing the Chinese food consumption with the Taiwanese food consumption, right? So they're all Chinese, and the consumption habits are similar. So usually at a certain consumption level, you observe certain food consumption patterns. What they did was they matched the 1990 Chinese food consumption pattern with the Taiwanese food consumption pattern roughly around 1975. Very comparable. So essentially the Chinese consumption pattern was very comparable in 1990 to what the Taiwanese were consuming in 1975. If you look at the Taiwanese GDP data, in 1975, the Taiwanese per capita GDP was about 1,000. The World Bank will tell you in 1990, the Chinese per capita GDP was 370, and Indian per capita GDP was 350. That's how this whole myth about how the two countries started at the same level, that's the data source. But if you go with the food consumption, the Chinese per capita GDP could have been between 2 and 3 times what the World Bank, Arvind.
So just to reinforce what you said, as big a damage was done by the World Bank in its poverty calculation.
Yeah.
They say poverty in China in 1980 is higher than India's.
Yeah, so
that's, I mean, it's just unbelievable nonsense.
It's
Actually, question on the fact that one reason was, when I did the history of the World Bank, to make China IDA eligible.
okay. So that's motivation. So
Lower, making more poor, otherwise.
yeah. So I'm not
The basic claim here is that China, to say that they were roughly similar in 1980 or 1990 is wrong.
I think that's totally wrong. And what my read of this entire history is that the level of the Chinese economy was understated. The growth was overstated, right? So, I think the size of the Chinese economy, the wage, we can come back to that. That's mainly because the capital and government shares of the GDP are very big in China. The labor share of the GDP is very small and actually declining. And in particular, Simon mentioned Tiananmen. That was actually the pivot. So essentially, before Tiananmen, the wage growth was exceeding the GDP growth. After Tiananmen, the wage growth lacked the GDP growth by a substantial amount. So it was a kind of FDI model, right? Cheap production. And remember the phrase, a factory for the world. So the FDI came into China to create factory over the world. It's interesting that in an economy that is growing 7, 8, 9% a year, it is not factory for China. So it's basically cost-based FDI rather than a market-based, because there's no market in China. The wage is so low, the consumption to GDP share is declining. The market is actually not that big, but the political repression of the labor and the whole rural decline in the 1990s created this incredible cost bonus, conferred cost bonus on foreign capitalists, but then it didn't help the Chinese consumption. So anyway, I just want to start with that, and then get to my assigned task. As I said, I was asked to talk about socialist business, but I'm going to go a little bit beyond that in my comments. And just a quick summary of that chapter. It was born on the basis of paternalistic status. You call it status, but the way I read it is taking care of, almost like a parent taking care of children. It's more paternalistic than...
That's what my mom means, mother and father.
A mother and father, right? So it's, the status thing is a little bit different. I mean, it's more power of the state. Yeah, so anyway. And then dismal performance, as Devesh pointed out, the opportunity costs are very high. But what's really interesting is it's so incredibly hard to get rid of, and I'm going to come back to that. And then the whole history of the SOEs is written in one chapter. I mean, that's amazing because we're talking about a history of 75 years in duration, all the way to Prime Minister Modi. So I just learned a lot because it's so rich and so compressed. But to be helpful, let me just raise some questions. I still have some kind of unanswered questions. One has to do with the overall performance of the Indian economy. That gets to the first chapter. And the SOE diagnostics. And why privatization is so hard. And the kind of this mystery of persistent informality, right? And that was more in chapter 1 than in chapter 2. And so my term to explain this is shy globalization. So India is not rejecting globalization, but it's kind of ambivalent about it. I wonder if that has played a role in sort of hard to get rid of SOEs and informality. So India growth phases, so I learned from the book, these are the 4 phases, right? The first is the Hindu rate of the growth, 1.5 per capita GDP growth rate. And then you have the second import substitution, mistakenly labeled, but let me just use the standard reference, 4.5. And then you have the neoliberal phrase, 7% per capita GDP, and this is like kind of the peak era. And then the 3%. Is that still the wrong, this is artificially inflated 3%? Or this is a real...
The artificially inflated is 7% level, percent per capita is minus 1.1, so about...
Okay, yeah. So these are the phases of the Indian growth. So I think my puzzle is always about India is, it's not that the country cannot achieve high growth. I mean, even in the 1970s, for a year or two, they were able to grow at 7%. It's just that it doesn't last, right? So for someone who's familiar with East Asia, that actually is the most puzzling part. Even the 7%, which persisted for 20 years, somehow it doesn't continue. I think that's the real puzzle. And 7% per capita GDP, for 20 years, you would imagine if you are able to grow at high level and then for 20 years, you will build some sort of momentum. So this is mystery to me. And growth begets growth. I think I heard that phrase from you, Arvind. Growth momentum, right? Growth. So the paper talks about vested interest in opposing SOE reforms and privatization, but also growth creates vested interest too, right? So why is it you only have vested interest in opposing good things rather than not vested interest in continuing with the good things? So there's something in Indian political economy that kind of prevented this dynamic. I think that, for me at least, I would want to know what is that? What is that?
Chinese high growth was 8% plus for 40 years.
Yeah, so you
have 7% basically saying 10 years, why not more?
So I don't buy the balance sheet. Let me come back to that, right? So and East Asia, same thing, right? So they could grow 40 years. And so I think for me, the difficulty is always how to start the growth. And then once you get the growth started, because growth builds up its own momentum. So is there something about the political economy dynamics, or maybe even business dynamics, right? So not just, we learn from the chapters, they did lots of things wrong, demonetization and all of that. But I think the deeper question is to ask why the economy and business are not resilient to bad policies. And we often hear, I think this is from Gujarat Das, right? The economy works at night, the government works during the day, right? But if the economy is so sensitive to what the government does, that clearly is wrong, right? So it's not a separate two things. One actually impacts the other pretty severely. So is there something beyond policy that also mattered? My impression of the book is that it is very heavy on the policy side. How come business and households cannot work around demonetization, right? So in China, everything now is moved to payment, electronic payment. The trigger for that was 2003 SARS. Once the pandemic happened, households, people don't go out, so then they have to use electronic payment. So, and now Indian government was doing this in 2016, when the electronic payment technology was much more developed, right? So why don't we observe this total shift from paper money to electronic payment? So why is the impact so durable, this demonetization? And the twin balance sheet, I'm not that convinced, not because I know a lot about Indian situation, but if you see when and where that problem begins to bite, you do see that in East Asia, but at a much higher level of per capita GDP, right? Also another kind of pushback is if you borrow and you invest in productivity, right, then you kind of enhance growth potentials rather than stalling growth. And I think, Arvind, when you say shenanigans, then I began to understand. So then that's the key thing, right? So it's not the twin balance sheet per se, it is that they are using money for shenanigans rather than for productivity. So East Asia was highly leveraged, but they grew for years and years, until they reached a very high income, right? Japan in 1990 was 75% of the US per capita GDP. Korea in 1997, that was already, Korea was the 11th largest economy already. So then I can understand, high debt can stall growth. But India was it's still so far away from that. So why is that different in India? SOE performance. So the chapter went through a number of factors. One is a legal factor, more public than enterprise, how the legal documents define the SOEs. Okay. Yeah. And multiple objective functions, lack of exit. But the thing is about SOEs don't perform anywhere, right? No matter what the legal country specifics are. So there's something universal about the SOEs. So is it really necessary for a reader to know these Indian specifics? There must be something more general than that can also explain. And so the privatization piece, so I would argue that the economics of the SOE is pretty straightforward, but the politics of the SOEs are very complicated, right? Privatization, reforms, and things like that. So, but the chapter's description of the politics of the SOE, at least in my sort of quick reading, is fairly general at a very high level. And for example, the status technology is cited as a factor. But communist countries manage to privatize, so they have a lot of status technology. And how does the ideology specifically constrain privatization? Let me skip that. And also, some of those factors, they kind of depreciate over time, right? So the fear of the job losses, I can understand in the 1950s and 60s when the economy was growing at 1.5%, you fear losses. But when the economy is growing at 7%, right, that fear should go away. Why not? why the fear didn't go away. And so before 1990, right, India was basically ruled by one party, right, Congress party. But after that, you have BJP, you have Congress party. How come different parties still share the same ideology? Even though they hated each other on many other dimensions. And also, what's also puzzling is that India never really had such a big state sector. It's not like they had a choke control of the economy. Compared with China, China even today has much bigger SOE, right? 33 million employment, and in terms of the numbers, it's not that big. GDP share is much bigger than what the Indian SOEs are in terms of the central SOEs. And compared with other East Asian economies, India is kind of comparable, right? So they start at a low point and they keep the same rather than reducing it. So why is it so difficult to privatize? That to me, that's the central mystery. And let me conclude on the informal sector, right? So it is really striking how large the informal sector is in India, right? 40–50% of the GDP, employment share is even higher, I think, right? Yeah, 80–90% of the employment, and it has persisted over time. So I think this is probably what you also meant, right? The lack of structural transformation, not just agricultural industry, agricultural to service, but lack of formalization and low productivity. So why the persistence? Usually we think about one of the roles of the public sector is that they are excessively formal, right? The bureaucracy, the whole kind of personnel system, and then there's some formalization because some of the informal sector is subject to indirect taxation. So let me conclude? Yeah, so let me conclude. So one puzzle is why the informal sector is not being replaced by small and medium enterprises that are formal, right? Because small, it doesn't mean it is always informal. And why SOEs don't play a bigger role in formalization? They can insist on the books, on the records, on the accounting. So my explanation is globalization. And compared with pre-Xi Jinping's China, India's globalization has been slow. And I used to be negative on globalization. I wrote a whole book about that. But more and more, selling China. But more and more, I actually believe that globalization is actually very good. And maybe the valuation of the SOEs will be different if you introduce FDI. Then the government would have bigger incentive to sell those enterprises. Maybe so. In the Chinese case, they list SOEs on the stock markets. When you do that, you are forced to go through a formalization process, especially if you list them on New York Stock Exchange or Hong Kong Stock Exchange, right? And foreign firms, when they buy from a Chinese company, selling shirts, selling shoes, they demand formalization. One of your colleagues, our former colleagues, Rick Locke, has written a lot of papers on this, right? So labor standard, environmental standard, quality standard, accounting standard, right? To get into the foreign export market network, you really need to go through this process of formalizing yourself and the role of the e-commerce, right? Alibaba started out not as so much of an e-commerce player. It started out as a formalization business. It provided labor and quality certificates to foreigners when they buy from China. So just some lingering questions, and I enjoy reading the chapters. Thank you.
So we have 15 minutes left. Maybe we can extend by 5 minutes or so at the let's see what questions jump up, which may require. I will say something I think may be very interesting to discuss, but of course you should decide what you. So the point that Yashang is making, that India's slow globalization compared to China may be one reason why he's arguing there is much greater informalization in India. And he's also asking another sort of very political economy question. If you say statism is the capture, the intellectual power of statist ideology is the reason for lack of privatization of SOEs, then how do we understand that the communist countries have been able to privatize much more? In China, I started doing it in the late 90s, I think, if I recall correctly the data. So what statist ideology, if we see it comparatively, perhaps is not doing the work. Something else is going on, right? So, and whatever else you wish to pick. I mean,
should we respond now, or should we get questions?
Why don't you respond now, and then let's say the first 5 minutes, and then we'll take more questions.
So let me, first of all, Simon and Yashin, terrific comments, thanks. And Simon, do send us the 45-slide PowerPoint. There's a lot of material there which we want to reflect on carefully, and I think excellent comments. Let me address just two, the ones that Ashu raised at the end, and just share some thoughts. Yashin, in one chapter, precisely this, by structural transformation, also explicitly talked about the informality thing. Why has it not happened? And India's levels of FDI have always been much lower than China. So partly goes to your thing. But to me, the most striking chart, one of the most striking charts which we haven't shown, is that if you if you look at what is China's share of the global labor force and what is China's share of global labor-intensive exports, right? China's and India's share of the global labor force is about 22-23%. They're all defined. China's share of global labor-intensive exports, even today, at its peak it was like 45%, now it's like, 38%. And India's is 4%.
India's?
4%. So I see that as a big part of the problem of lack of formalization, because, right, if you never did, labor-intensive exports like this, there was no way because, as you said, it can't be sustained on the basis of the domestic market, too poor, so on. So because India couldn't do that, it lost out on formal sector jobs, formality, and then combined with the fact that you don't get the FDI, so all of that. So I do think, but then what the chapter tries to do is, well, why did that happen? Why were we not able to become part of these things? And so there we have a series of explanations which may not be fully satisfactory, but that's exactly what we try and address. And I would say that even the not globalizing is, again, not a cause but one proximate manifestation which requires further explanation, which is what we try and do in the third chapter, but that's very much a part of it. Now, one of the things that I think is worth highlighting on the state-owned enterprise thing is that if you look at India today with state-owned enterprises, it's kind of almost like a non-issue now. It's become too small relative to the size of the economy, okay? So essentially, I think, and now I'm not giving cause, but I'm giving more description than I'll get to cause, that in the 90s, when the liberalization process began, India's approach to this was, allow entry, not to kill, not to privatize. So essentially by growing the private sector, we shrank the public sector and started reducing its importance, partly because it was much easier to do, So if you take all the major sectors, telecom, banking, finance, air transportation, and it's almost a very explicit decision that, we have a big public sector incumbent, and I'll come to that in just a second, we're not going to privatize too costly. So what we do is just allow private sector entry. So in some ways, through inaction, we've kind of solved, not solved, but whatever the problem of that has diminished over time. And so the question is, but your question remains, why didn't we privatize? So at that point in time, allowing entry is just a much simpler political economy choice, right? You allow that. But the other thing, I think the communist analogy is not quite appropriate, because much of that happened under conditions of kind of absolute crises and systemic transformations. If you take Russia, if you take Eastern Europe, it was basically, a complete collapse, and therefore they took we will privatize explicitly, whereas India said we will not privatize, we will allow entry. And so the question was, we adopted a very different approach, and we paid the costs. But organically, the costs have declined over time because the private sector has grown over time. So the question remains: is it statism or something deeper? But I think this was, by the way, the SOE problem remains in China too today. Yeah, and so in that sense, the India-China comparison shows that it's much, and that I would say the communists, the Soviet, Eastern Europe, was actually a very different thing, and India is more, doing this, doing privatization under normal conditions seems much more difficult than doing it under conditions of crisis, as in Soviet Union or Russia.
Let's take questions now. I think 10 minutes we have. So, huh? Yeah. You picking up something that Simon said, right?
Yeah, to that end. Simon, one of the things you pointed out was that we didn't really discuss much about the demography. And actually, we've been struggling with some things would be interesting to hear from you. See, whatever the many critics of India, and we have many, the fact is, from the time of independence to now, it's added 1 billion more people. And it's made those 1 billion additional people much more educated, given the sheer. The thing that we've struggled is, how should one think about scale? In some development economics, we think about size. We don't have a good understanding of scale. The way that China and India really stand out is just the scale problem, right? As giants. Now, when you go to the very nice graphs you're showing about wage labor, wages in manufacturing, is it apt to compare a country like Korea with 50 million and the labor force is, say, 30 million, with the India, China, where the labor force is 500 million, and you're transforming them? And in a sense, it's related, not indirectly, to your new book, is that can you shift so many people so fast?
In China, you did.
Yeah, but that's why you're comparing to China.
That's why
you say that's why you're saying South Korea is not. I mean, Japan maybe, but Japan is 100 million plus, but South Korea is tiny, right?
So one of the things I'd love to hear: how should one think about scale in this context? Does it matter? And what are the complex ways that it's not the same? It's not a linear extrapolation. That's all I'm saying, and that's something we've been struggling.
So, Simon, there's also just, I think your point is very well taken. That's why the first chart is a cross-country chart, every country, not just China. But I mean, having done this for so long and having been in India for so long, if you do, I'm just doing hypothetical. If you have an elaborate comparison on India, Korea, the first response will be, we're so big, we're so heterogeneous, not a good comparison. What about China?
I was the first younger scholar, or perhaps the first scholar from India, in India, presenting in 1986 a paper comparing Indian and South Korean economic strategy and since 1950. This was at Delhi University, and two people, their response was, as senior professors, I was a junior, I was doing my PhD at the time, why don't you compare South Korea and the city of Ludhiana? What is the point of comparing South Korea? This is what the city of Ludhiana. Actually, that was also not right in some ways, but you see the point, the metaphor, huh?
In addition to quantitative scale, there's qualitative scale, if I may put it that way.
Yeah.
Homogeneity of Korea as a society.
Yeah, there are two things they would say, exactly.
One is scale, the other is homogeneity.
Yeah, that's on both scores they would say that, exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying, therefore, that I do think we should reflect some of that, of aspirational stuff in what you said, but,
How much time do development economists spend on Japan today? Or on a history of Europe? I mean, different societies, different scales, I understand, but I think you're top coding, you're setting your aspirations too low, guys, honestly.
Setting expectations?
I'm saying their aspirations for India are being set too low by the framing of this comparison, which is a pretty serious matter.
Okay, let's take questions. I think we'll go on till 4:10 or so. Okay, are we allowed to? There is no other meeting here. Okay, let's go on to, because several hands are up. So let's, Ashish raised his hand first, then Patrick, and then Gautam. And let's take, rather than responding individually, let's just get the question. Yeah. Ashish.
I have an epistemological question.
Epistemological question, okay.
The question that you both spoke about the corrupted nature of the data or the adulterated nature of the data, especially now in the context of Modi's time. And I'm trying to even, in a way, you spoke about how World Bank was also kind of fudging data, probably of some kind. So I'm just curious, as political scientists, political economists, when the data world is slippery, how are you making such epistemological claims? And this is a meta question, not very specific.
Okay.
Like, how are you making such epistemological claims, especially in the context that the claims that you make seems to be so formidably objective? So I'm just trying to, this is just a kind of meta question.
Okay, so when the data is slippery, how do you handle that is would be another way to reformulate that. Patrick.
So first of all, I can't wait to see the rest of the book. It's a fantastic project. It's so great to see an economist working with political scientists, and this whole panel has been fabulous. And to have so many prominent economists tell us we shouldn't believe any of the data is really interesting. It raises all sorts of questions, and I love what Simon did, raising the question about labor and using ILO data. But when I think of the India-China comparison, in particular manufacturing, and speaking to some of the data that you guys have pulled together, for me, one of the measures of growth is a little tricky. Obviously, of course, we care about growth, but when you look at the way China scales up through the value chain, that's what's so stunning, right? I mean, whether it's solar panels or windmills or EVs, right now they can't export all their EVs because they haven't built enough ships to export all the EVs they have, right?
Not to mention the others are blocking.
That too, the US is. And that's still, and this comes back to this question of, even if the growth levels are not maybe as far apart as we think they are, the productive capacities, the capacity to get large quantities of shit onto the global market and scale up through the value is still, and I do think this comes back to the labor question, this fundamental structural problem of the size of the informal set of workers who are just kind of outside of the formal capitalist economy, and where the economic logic is still, to use that old Marxist tech terminology, it's still labor squeezing as opposed to investing in the enhanced productive capacity of labor, right? And it strikes me that's the big structural transformations. I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about why that hasn't happened. And then, since the state features so centrally in these explanations, it does strike me that the Indian state, and here I have to, a little shout out to Pranav, because I don't think it's a statist theory. I mean, his classic book, The Political Economy book, it's a state capture theory. You have three dominant factions that have captured the state or using it to distribute rents, etc. And what's striking in comparison to East Asia is that the Indian state lacks relative autonomy. You know, politicians, I mean, there is a Weberian bureaucracy, there's tremendous capacity, there's tremendous ability, but the ability of the bureaucracy to actually make and implement decisions independently of day-to-day particularistic interests is nowhere near as distant or as autonomous as it is in East Asia. And it's not just because it's a democracy. There are lots of democracies where states have a lot of autonomy. Northern Europe would be a good example, right? And then finally, in terms of comparisons, I have to mention Brazil, because Brazil starts out a lot like India, and it has the same sort of colonial legacies, deep hierarchical inequalities, tremendous violence on top of it, passes through a period of authoritarianism. And yet in the last 20 years, the size of the informal sector in Brazil has come down dramatically.
Size of the informal sector?
Yeah, huge. And a lot of this is minimum wage increase, 15 minimum wage increases under the PT, Bolsa Familia. And another key point, and I think this was implicit in Yashwan's analysis as well, the strength of local government. The big difference between Brazil and India is Brazilian municipalities have a shit ton of capacity and autonomy. They can coordinate at the local level, and that's part of the Chinese growth story as well. And so as we disaggregate the state, and I know you have a chapter on subnational state, and I know you've been thinking a lot about local state, so it's just an invitation to say more from the book.
Gautam.
I have a few comments, but I just wanted to start by saying that I just learned so much from this panel in an hour and a half. It was just terrific. And I also can't wait to read the rest of the book. And one of the things I really liked is just that simple descriptive data, and everything is communicated through charts and tables, which are very comprehensible. And I think we overturn a lot of conventional wisdom also, like in just this panel. A few chapters, and probably the rest of chapters too. I thought that the theory, I'm going to make an unfair comment here, so please forgive me. So maybe, it was reminding me of like when you go to a Korean restaurant, you get all the little delightful kimchi and these small things, to eat before you eat them. And I think the theory perhaps lags so that is that you have all this data which overturns a lot of like what we think about the Indian economy. But then the theory sort of relies on what we kind of already think we know about the Indian economy. That Nehru believed this, and that's why they did the policy, because that was Nehru's ideology, and that's, ideas matter. And I think that, like, even going further on Yashan's point, like, what is the political economy of the SOEs? Who were the winners and losers? And, like, perhaps, like, saying which is more important and why. Like, I don't think the idea, that ideas matter argument is really demonstrated at all to the extent that you might want to make this screen more light. That was one sort of comment. Like for example, Air India, I don't believe it has anything to do with intellectuals. Probably has more to do with the fact that the civil aviation minister makes a lot of money from the Boeing contracts that Air India, buys. It has nothing to do with the MyGov state and so on. I don't think. And I thought Ashoka made a separate point, which is that even communist states seem to have privatized a lot of these enterprises. And certainly, while we expect this, especially because the British state was actually quite minimal and did not engage in all this stuff. So this shift towards believing the state should do everything for people would have happened in a relatively short span of time. That was one thought I had. The second one was about SOEs and what they do. I think you're absolutely right about that. The fact that they solve certain political problems, right? And one way to think about it is that, the SOEs were just a bottomless pit where so much money went in. The other way to think about it is they were kind of redistributive, not just across like classes, but also across regions. And the core problem that these elites faced was how do you keep this heterogeneous country together? And maybe the SOEs did that to some extent. I found the number, the 5% number, once you rephrase it, to be very implausible. I think you may not want to lean into that because it's just so gigantic. 5 percentage points of GDP growth every year is
So 5%. See, so it's a $3 trillion economy now. 5% of that, it could be higher. That's the point.
But it's every year.
So every year, yes. So every year you can do that.
It's not about growth. It's about level.
So
but if the level is $100 in 1950 and you're saying it's $105,
yeah.
I'm saying that it's five of those dollars every single year cumulatively. That's just basically saying that growth is 5%. 5 percentage points higher. So is it compounded is my question.
Yeah, we'll clarify that.
Okay.
Yeah, we can.
And then finally, I mean,
Yeah.
it raises an intriguing question about the optimal size of nations, which is that, one thing I notice in the US is that wherever you go in the US, it basically looks the same. Cities, towns, okay, maybe New York City looks a little different, but the level of public goods provision is always over than McDonald's, right? And India just looks spatially very different. I've never been to China. And that too, if you think about what South Korea is able to achieve, at a basic level, maybe India shouldn't be the nation state that it is, because you have to do all this redistribution across units, and all these things that you're mentioning are really kind of accomplished. I really want to ask.
So I think this idea, maybe both of you can address this one, that in many ways, public sector development in India became a redistributive mechanism and a way to bring some regions into the national mainstream or imagination. So you were investing in Bihar and Odisha, right? And you were investing in the south, HMT in Bangalore and all that. Is there something there? I mean,
we discuss it in one chapter. Yeah.
So
But
yeah.
I can talk about it.
Oh, yeah, okay. Maybe, yeah, we'll go till, we have 5 more minutes. So, Marshall, yeah.
I just started earlier to ask the question if India has leapfrogged, I don't know if it's the right analogy. If India has leapfrogged manufacturing, what's next? Is the frog dead? Does it leap from here? But I don't know. It's another way of asking it is much more directly is what Dashan has said, which is, why does it keep going on like this? Why is there not at some point a real change in the course of the Indian economy?
Why not more manufacturing?
Why not more manufacturing? Why not more?
Why not more formal sector? Why not more formalization?
Why not more globalization? Why not more exports? Why not more?
Okay.
Okay.
Last five.
So just a few. So Ashish, to respond to yours, we've tried in every case to go beyond just the GDP numbers. So when you're doing human capital, you use the NFHS over infrastructure. Is sort of a more reliable, highways, roads, bridges. So we've done an interesting thing looking at state building through bridge building, where we constructed a database over 100 years of all major bridges built across Indian rivers. There are different definitions. And you can really see just an exponential change after the 90s, especially last quarters. This is not about BJP or Congress, it's just a general trend. So there are ways in which you cannot obviously get around that problem, but hopefully with the supplemental information, you can see if there are some completely major differences or if it's broadly consistent. That's sort of, because these are the official numbers, we cannot reinvent. So that's a...
But on the whole, Ashish, on the whole, when you hear someone like Angus Deaton speak about the statistical systems of India, his claim is, and we are talking with serious economists, right, who's dealt with a lot of data in his life. He's a data guy. His claim is that India's economic statistics were the best in the global south. Not infallible, no, but the best in the global. Nothing was as good as India's statistical systems.
Till about
and
the
nowhere.
90s, yeah.
Until
How about the 90s?
Yes. This was the argument. Now, I think what he would say now about the data, if Arvind is making... Anyway, that's the thing. So slipperiness of data does apply to some years, some area, and some domains also. On my right data, I could never use government data. I had to create it in all kinds of ways. Right?
But sorry, can I just say, see, one is what Devesh said. In the rest of the book, we use all kinds of data from all kinds of sources. So there's a lot of risk spreading. And the second thing, even in this growth chapter, I mean, the whole point, we're able to show that GDP is whatever because we have all this other data to sort of correlate it with and get some validation on.
Okay.
So Patrick, in response to your thing, one of the things you do see about labor that has changed, the puzzle about the socialist period was how little attention was paid to just skilling labor. Just skilling, There were these ITIs created, but after that, and under the UPA government was the first time you had a national skilling mission. And a lot of resources really began to be pumped into just skilling labor. But to tell you how far India has to go. So, Israel is now recruiting labor from India for the construction sector. Forget about the ethics, that's a separate thing, all of that. So, the construction sector people from Israel came to India and for them, this is not the usual Indian, you take an exam, you have to actually show your skills. So they have, these rods, how you bend them when you construct something. So only 8% of the people who applied and went through, so they were already screened, actually could demonstrate the minimum level of skills that Israel wanted, and they were going to get massive increases in wages, right, compared to what. And that just shows this is
where in India?
This is Haryana and Punjab and Western UP, that's where they were recruited, where you've had huge increases in construction, so there's a pool of labor with those skills, right? So there is this huge problem of skilling that is, but I would say two things are really changing informality in different ways. The GST, because it is forcing firms now along the value chain, so you know their numbers and data, and you really see an increases in tax revenues and GST revenues. And the second, which is fairly digitization, digital public infrastructure. Yeah. So if you look at the UPI, which started in about 2016, now it's close to 500 million transactions per day. So and once it's digital, it's not informal, it's not cash. But Arvind tells me the irony is DPI has been increasing massively, but cash has been also increasing.
Cash is above demonetization of GDP, so both are.
So we're not sure why both are. Usually you would expect one goes, the other goes down. So that's another.
My recent trip to China made me feel that now India's digitalization and China's digitalization are roughly similar, at least in the cities.
Right.
There is no difference the way you pay your Uber or taxi or you go to a store, buy shirts. I bought shirts because laundering my shirts at the Marriott in Shanghai was much more expensive than buying a new shirt. This is what's happened to labor in some of the sectors. Anyway, wages in some sectors. But
sorry, I just finished this. Yeah. So Gautam, you're absolutely right that the theory is weak. Right now, what we are struggling with is just the history and the facts have made the chapter so long, and we have to cut. And the question is how much we can afford on the theory. But we need a stronger argument for sure. You're absolutely right. See, I think I partly agree with you on Air India, but only partly. Remember, Air India was first being privatized. So you're right that this minister under the UPA, we know Praful Patel, made tons of money, all of that. But way before, when under Vajpayee they tried to privatize, the left was absolutely opposed. And all privatization stopped. There was some under Vajpayee and Shori in the first NDA. It completely stopped until the CPM was part of the governing coalition. And the CPM, whatever its other faults, they didn't make money from the private, right? It's all the other regional parties. Theirs was a purely ideological opposition. And so there is the money part, no doubt about it. But there was definitely a part which was ideological, where it's hard to see how the CPM actually gained anything from her.
But why was CPM was not part of the Vajpayee regime?
No, I'm saying
when they stopped even that they did something, but they couldn't sell
Air India then. But we write when Shori's own interview that it was torpedoed not by labor unions, not by the left, but by the private sector competitor, which was Jet Airways then. So he is scathing about the private sector's role in preventing privatization because they did not want a competitor.
So on privatization, I think the empirical fact today is the only sector where there's really big public sector ownership is the banking system. I mean, the others are all now, even if you don't get privatized, India can live without them. They're small, right?
Some mining.
But mining, but banking. And so two things to say about banking are, Arun Jaitley said, Arvind, you bring to try and nationalize even one bank. Out of 540 parliamentarians, if you get more than 5, I will change my name. Now, whether that is, I think it's a combination of both. One is the, patronage, and because, it is a source of patronage, and B, there's this, you're selling the family silver, whatever, the idea thing is very strong.
Deeply.
But
Guys don't care about, think of the 540 parliamentarians in India. How many of them would you think are so wedded to, that you can buy a lot of votes with $10 million?
So, the thing is that, and the nice thing about banking also, which we show in the other chapter, is you're getting endogenous exit from the banking system, both on the thing. So, like you're allowing entry, creditors, depositor, whatever. So, only one thing we didn't answer, I think, Patrick. Patrick, one of the themes of the book, and this is the...
But the state autonomy question?
Yeah,
or
the
Brazil
local government.
Local government.
State autonomy, I'll leave it to you political scientists. I don't know enough about that. But that's why I began by saying growth has had this, causal primacy, especially because state autonomy has been weak. That's why I think growth is so important. In India, see, one of the themes of the book, and what Devesh also showed, and this is across the board, whether it's state-owned enterprises, remember, health, education, land reform were all state issues. So, and one theme of our book is anything that the center has done badly, the states have done much worse. So at least on the first and the second tier, decentralization is no panacea. Now, but now you brought in the third tier. Now, the third tier is a bit more complex in India because at the moment, what it seems is that third tier rural the experience has been more promising, accountability, rural panchayats, gram panchayats, etc. But third tier urban has been an absolute disaster.
Agreed.
A complete
That's what we are
disaster.
finding.
And so, now why that is complicated, we may touch upon this, but, so the kind of left progressive kind of decentralization as the mantra, at least from first to second tier, has been completely belied by the Indian experience.
Just one last thing on state autonomy. Indian state has been very autonomous on entry. It has had very little autonomy on exit. So by that I mean whenever it wants to start something new, absolutely. In fact, all it does is start new things all the time, right?
No, I think Pranab's argument was partly proven wrong in 1991.
Yeah, exactly.
I think I wrote a critique in Illustrated Weekly of India at that time. I said this is the idea that these three classes completely dominate and the state has no autonomy.
I've said in this chapter you will find that 91, everything changes. Then what happened to all these vested interests?
Exactly, and Bombay Plan people, the capitalists were opposed to the opening. Bajaj, etc., were opposed to the opening, and the Indian state hammered them basically. Yashan, last point, and then we come. Yeah.
So this discussion is interesting in part because I think I was struck by the fact that in Indian economic policy making, in Indian politics, there is so much debate almost about every issue, right? So you refer to Indian democracy as a precautious democracy. So one factor probably is democracy or democracy and more debate. But if you look at East Asia, right? So we never debated about these issues. We just went ahead and began to do these things. And I think there's a learning aspect, right? So Korea explicitly modeled itself after Japan. So there's no debate. Look at Japan. They develop auto industry, steel industry. We do exactly the same thing. They have MITI, We created something similar to India, right? So even though they didn't say they copied Japan, they copied Japan. China copied Korea, China copied. So in India, I think the country is so unique from almost everybody else. It's a little bit like America in 1776, right? So essentially it's a country that has to be born on the basis of debate. But that has a cost, right? Which is that you don't make decisions and you can't scale. And why do we keep debating about privatization? Why do we keep debating about export-oriented strategy? All of that has been settled. Let's
just do it.
Just
Nike.
do it, right? So, I mean, this
But
is
you'll be
my
glad
kind
that's,
of very,
that's the
Modi,
Modi
yeah,
government.
that's Modi. That's what Modi.
yeah,
no
so
debate, just do it.
I think there's something to that, right? So it's kind of an engineering approach, right? The answers are already there, the solutions are there, everything else is about implementation. I never get the sense that India as a whole has reached that stage, right?
No,
almost
everything has to be debated.
And then restart the conversation.
Okay, we should. Then I think we have to go now. We can continue the conversation outside over the reception. We have gone 20 minutes over, and let's. Huh?
We'll do it outside.
Yeah. Let's
Marshall,
do
we'll come
that.
back
Time to thank Arvind, Devesh, Simon, and Yashang for a terrific.